Hello and welcome back to Wyoming Watch from the Wyoming Tribune-Eagle. I'm Noah Zahn, your state government reporter here. On Monday, our crime and public safety reporter Ivy Secrest and our staff photographer Milo Gladstein joined the Laramie County Sheriff's Office for a ride-along following the Sheriff's Office's new partnership with ICE, or Immigration and Customs Enforcement. During this ride-along, they witnessed several drivers pulled over and detained for deportation by ICE. This week on Wyoming Watch, we're sharing a conversation that I had with Ivy and Milo about that experience. Here's that conversation now. Okay, now I'm here with Milo and Ivy. You guys had a busy Monday, and I guess to start off, can you just kind of tell me a bit about that?
Yeah, so Monday morning at around 4 a.m., Milo and I pulled up to the Laramie County Sheriff's Department, and we were there to do a ride-along with mostly 287G certified deputies who were working with the Wyoming Highway Patrol and at least 2 ICE agents, I believe, to do a targeted operation, pulling over commercial drivers for safety violations, and then in some cases, subsequently checking their immigration status.
And so while you guys were on this ride-along, can you tell me just kind of what you saw?
Yeah, so we were in a really unique situation. We were initially under the impression that we were going to be in the same car. But upon arrival, deputies decided that it would be better for us to be in 2 separate cars. So I went with Sergeant Jason Gillett, who is a naturalized citizen from Britain, gone through the immigration process and sought citizenship to become a law enforcement agent again. And then Milo was with Chief Deputy Aaron Veldier and got to see a little bit more action. And he took him through some of those aspects of it for the photo side of this story.
Yeah, so the operation took place from about 4 a.m. until around 11 or 12 in the morning. We were along State Highway 214 out near between Burns and Carpenter, and then down south to the state border where the Wyoming Highway Patrol had a commercial vehicle checkpoint where all vehicles needed to stop to go under inspection from the Highway Patrol. For various things such as speeding, leaking diesel, unsafe brakes, overweight. Those were kind of some of the common issues that were found throughout that. They also had scales that are kind of like industrial bathroom scales almost, like that most people have, and they would put them under each tire and have the truck roll onto that scale, and then they would take the weight of each tire or wheel, and then they would add that up to get a full weight of the vehicle. And so a lot of times it was found that they were overweight and did not have the proper permits to be overweight.
Mm-hmm. And when we're looking at those violations, we're not looking at like a couple pounds overweight. We're looking at thousands of pounds overweight. So vehicles on an 80,000 pound maximum road who are hitting that 100,000 pound upper limit. And the reason that this operation is happening out on 214 as opposed to on I-80 or I-25 where you have these ports of entry, these formal scales set up, is because a lot of the people, not all, but some of the truckers who are frequenting this highway are purposefully avoiding the ports of entry. And so initially, Sheriff Kozak received a lot of complaints from the people who live out in Carpenter and Burns about the truckers who were coming through that area. We had one instance where a trucker's brakes seized up at the checkpoint. And that just kind of tells you that some of these vehicles, their brakes aren't being checked properly. Their tires are worn, and that does pose a bit of a safety risk. I think we've all kind of seen in the last few weeks trucks blown over on the side of the road, semis flipped on the side of I-25. There are very strict rules for truckers for a reason, and so the initial access point for checking up on people is these safety concerns. But then what follows is these further questions about the immigration status, typically after coming to the determination that the driver's license was not valid. And then ICE takes it from there.
Yeah, there are verifications that need to take place. So a lot of this was mostly safety oriented, vehicles that are on the road that shouldn't be on the road due to safety violations. And so everybody that was stopped by deputies was due to either safety violations or typical things found at the checkpoint, or standard roadway violations such as speeding, running stop signs, that kind of thing. And upon further questioning with some of the people, it was determined that they were undocumented, which was verified by multiple agencies multiple different times before ICE became involved. This included a field interview as well, conducted by each deputy.
And so after those, traffic stops occurred, you were just talking about how there were field interviews. Can you tell me more about what that interaction was like and what these officers were looking for in determining when to contact ICE or how to handle the situation differently? I'm sure each interaction you witnessed was different, but can you tell me sort of, I guess, kind of the checklist items for the different types of interactions?
So there is a formal checklist with the field interview. There are 12 questions that 287G deputies can ask should they suspect that immigration is in question. And then one of the deputies, who asked not to be named for safety reasons, is a native Spanish speaker. And so he would go through those same 12 questions, and then at the very end, if he's conducting that interview in Spanish, he would ask directly, are you working and living here illegally in the U.S.? And if someone says yes to that, that's an admission of guilt, and that's a reason to call ICE. But those aren't the only things that they're looking for. There are other things that can trigger deputies to call dispatch and run information on the person, or call ICE and run information on the individual. One of them is Colorado issues certain driver's licenses that aren't valid for federal use, so they're not valid for voting, federal identification, travel, that sort of thing. But they are valid for driving, just not in the state of Wyoming anymore. And so if someone who is driving a commercial vehicle presents that license, it's reason to check the CDL and see if their CDL or their commercial driver's license is valid. And it's also reason to call ICE and run their information, because you could run someone's name through a bunch of different databases, NCIC, through dispatch, through local, whatever, and immigration won't necessarily come up. That is a database that ICE has better access to. And so those are just some of the things that they were looking for. It really did, at least in the briefing, deputies were reminded of what documentation you're looking for. So hopefully that answers your question. And yeah. Milo actually witnessed 2 different scenarios in which an individual's immigration status was questioned, and one of those did result in a detention or an ICE arrest.
First situation that I witnessed was a commercial truck driver who was pulled over, and upon contacting the driver, we ran his driver's license and learned that he was originally from Cuba but had legal U.S. immigration status. So he was legal. He had all of his paperwork in order. However, upon taking him to the Highway Patrol inspection point that he was supposed to stop at and did not stop at, I believe, it was found that his vehicle was 17,500 pounds overweight, as well as he had a warrant for failure to appear, which resulted in him not having a valid CDL license. So that resulted in the driver's arrest in the jail here in Laramie County. The other scenario that I witnessed was driving near Laramie County Community College. We watched a pickup truck pulling a work trailer kind of deal run a stop sign. And so we ended up pulling that vehicle over for running the stop sign. And upon questioning the driver said that he did not have a physical driver's license on him and thought that his driver's license might be expired. After learning this information, the deputy spoke to the passenger of the vehicle and said, hey, do you have a driver's license? And if so, you guys can switch seats, and we can go from there. And, if your friend or passenger has a valid driver's license, you guys are good to go. And the passenger stared blankly at Chief Deputy Valdir, which to him was an indicator that he might not speak English. And so coming back to the police car, we contacted dispatch, ran both of their names, and it turned out that the driver of the vehicle did have a valid driver's license. He just didn't have it physically on him at that time. And no record for the passenger came up in any system that was searched. At that point, Chief Deputy Valdir took the field interview questions and started to interview the passenger in Spanish and wasn't able to get a lot from him. At that point, he called one of the other deputies, the native Spanish-speaking deputy, as well as the ICE agents who were out with us as well. They showed up, and the deputy first began his line of questioning in Spanish, which resulted in the passenger admitting that he was working and living illegally in the country. This was verified by ICE, and he was then taken into custody at that point by ICE and arrested. The driver of the vehicle was let off for a warning for running the stop sign.
And so a lot of what you guys are talking about is a lot of this was done under the premise of safety. And, a big part of it is it's not safe to have non-English speaking commercial drivers on the interstate. Is that accurate, Ivy?
So there are certain English-speaking requirements for commercial drivers, and they're relatively new, or they've been increased recently and more heavily enforced in the past year or so under the new Trump administration. And part of the reasoning for these enforcements is people who are delivering or hauling cargo, it could be sand, packages, whatever, need to be able to read signs. One of the ones that was discussed heavily on Monday was the wind warnings. So, it's important that people who are driving can read, no vehicles under this weight, high-profile vehicles that is typically talking about semis. That's not to say that every person who isn't a native English speaker or who doesn't speak English proficiently to have a conversation with a deputy can't understand the road signs or may not recognize road signs. And that's also not to say that English speakers also don't ignore those warnings sometimes. That happens as well. But it is one of the things that they're authorized to check for, and those English-speaking requirement tests can only be administered by the Wyoming Highway Patrol. They're certified to do that. There's no one with the Laramie County Sheriff's Office who's certified to administer that test. But yeah, this operation was focused on initial contact being for probable cause related to safety. We've talked about all of the potential safety hazards and what that looks like. But those initial follow-ups are triggered by once you've made contact with the driver or passengers in the vehicle, what might indicate that an individual maybe doesn't have legal status, maybe doesn't have all their documentation, or in some cases maybe has their documentation but doesn't have a commercial driver's license. And it's an interesting thing. It's something that in the past, if deputies don't have these 287G agreements and they don't go through the certification and they don't have that training, that situation looks very different. You can still go through the process of writing up the ticket, arresting someone if that's applicable to the situation, citing the driver. But it's these 287G agreements that allow deputies to ask immigration-related questions and follow up on their suspicions related to those questions and then involve ICE for an arrest on scene. Where in the past, if a if a deputy pulled someone over and had suspicions around immigration, they could document the person's name and everything. They could, do all of these interview questions, but they would have to let that individual go and just inform ICE, and then ICE would handle it later. And so what's really unique about these operations is it means that ICE can show up on scene and that individual is not even being processed through the Laramie County Jail. They're going directly into the custody of ICE. And that is something that is absolutely new as of October 1st and as of these contracts and as of these trainings. And it has sparked a lot of local conversation about whether or not that's ethical, whether or not this is something that the Laramie County Sheriff's Office should be doing, what the pros and cons of doing it are. And there is, when you talk to local advocates for immigrants, there is a lot of concern around the potential for profiling. There's concern around the potential for people being targeted. There's a lot of fear for mixed status families who, some people might have legal status, some people might not, and they're in the same family unit. I can say, and I think Milo observed the same thing, specifically with these CDL operations, with these commercial motor vehicle operations. I mean, we started this at 4 a.m. It is pitch black out. We're on a not well lit highway between Carpenter and Burns, which are very minimally populated towns. And there's really, at least from what we were shown and what we observed, there's really no way to tell who's driving the vehicle. You just know that a semi ran a stop sign and that it's now your job to pull that person over. That's not to say that after contact with the driver, additional things can't happen, but there's really no way to tell who the driver is when you're pulling them over. And that is only applicable to these operations. That's not obviously applicable to your standard person driving around town. But there is, it has sparked a lot of conversation. And the safety aspect of it, Kozak is in a very unique position. He has a lot of history with these agreements. He worked in Arizona, in Maricopa County, and Maricopa County's sheriff in 2011 famously was sued for the way that he was utilizing his 287G agreements. He was accused of discrimination, and that lawsuit came out in, not in the sheriff's favor. It absolutely came out that in Maricopa County, that sheriff had been profiling people, and Kozak was working with the Maricopa, or he was working with the police in that area at that time, and he told his officers to avoid those operations, to not be involved. Because as he said, he's seen what it looks like when these agreements are used for profiling, and that's something that he seems very concerned about. That's not to say that there isn't still a conversation to be had about how these agreements are used and what the long-term impact is going to be. We've only had these deputies since October. And it's hard to tell at this point what exactly that's going to look like long-term use of these things.
Mm-hmm. You just touched on a lot of the things I wanted to ask you about, which is good. And you referenced the Maricopa County situation in your story, which came out earlier this week. You also reference conversations you had with ACLU of Wyoming. And, there's, from his perspective, there's a lot of that local concern about profiling. Can you tell me a bit more what he had to say about this partnership? And I'm not sure if you told him about your ride along and what he thought of that.
So, yeah, I spoke with Antonio Serrano of the Wyoming ACLU, and he was aware of the ride along at the time that we spoke. We spoke Tuesday, a day after the ride along had happened. And he was also aware of a similar operation that happened in November of this year that was pretty well publicized by the sheriff's office. And in the aftermath of that, not necessarily people who had been impacted by the operation, to be clear. People who live in community and were just hearing of the operation were very concerned about profiling, about the risks of those types of things, had come to him and have been coming to him since these contracts started being discussed. I think the first story I wrote about it was in the beginning of this year, when Trump really reintroduced this option, because it wasn't an option for a long time because of instances like Maricopa County. And so there is a fear for people who have immigrated here who, regardless of their status, are concerned about being profiled, especially when it comes to the English-speaking issue. There are people born in the U.S. whose primary language up until kindergarten is Spanish because of the part of the country that they're growing up in. And so, Antonio absolutely has some concerns around profiling in that regard. The other aspect of it is I have spoken with other people in Cheyenne who have gone through the process of trying to contact a loved one or a former employee or a family member after they've been detained by ICE. And that's an aspect of this that is very difficult to report on. It's a really difficult process once a family member has been detained to contact them. ICE has been accused of not providing contact information or information on the location of individuals. And so, there is the aftermath of these decisions, whether you're contacting someone for safety reasons, whether you're detaining them because they have a warrant out for their arrest, or they've entered the country multiple times without proper documentations, without going through the established channels. A lot of times there is a broader impact beyond that individual, and that can be family members, that can be dependents. And in talking with Valdir, he did mention that people do have the right to reach out to family and contact them from the jail or provide contact information to forward things along. They do document these agency assists is what it's called when they make the initial stop, but then ICE makes the arrest. It's an agency assist. They do document that. But, it's not like you're going to get a text notification that your loved one was picked up on I-25. It's just a much more complicated process than that, as it is for any arrest. And so, yeah, there is a broader impact, and I think that's what a lot of our local immigrant advocates are very concerned about.
Yeah, it was, especially obviously at night, it was really dark out. It was pitch black on that road. There's no way to tell the identity of the driver before we had pulled them over. It was just, we knew that they were speeding, they were overweight, whatever it may be, they were leaking something, and that was the reason for the stop. Regarding the incident with the person who was arrested by ICE due to the driver running a stop sign, even that was in, mid-morning, right outside of Laramie County Community College. The stop had nothing to do with the passenger's race. The stop had to do with the fact that the driver ran a stop sign. We were well down the road from them and couldn't see who was driving the vehicle, even if you wanted to. There was no way to tell. And so the driver was pulled over for running a stop sign. There was no racial profiling that I saw.
So how often do these operations happen? I doubt they're out there at 4 a.m. every morning, but...
These operations are in addition to standard deputy duties. Okay. So this isn't a shift per se that they're signed up for. Much like getting the certification, these deputies have volunteered to take on these responsibilities. They've volunteered to show up and do this. They are, of course, getting paid, but they have chosen to take this on in addition to their standard shift. And at this point, it has happened twice. Once in November, once this month. It is very likely that this will continue, but it's unclear. The frequency is unclear. Kozak and I did discuss if there was a point in the future where he could see not needing to renew these certifications because of not seeing the safety issues, which he says are his primary concern. And these certifications get renewed every 2 years. And he did say if we hit the point where there's not a safety concern anymore, I don't see the point in paying to have, going through this process and having these certifications renewed if it's no longer a problem. But yeah, it is unclear at this point how frequently this is going to happen going forward. I think the only thing I did want two things. One, it was very interesting being in the situation where I was riding along with someone who was a naturalized citizen, someone who had gone through the immigration process, granted in a very different way than a lot of people do. Gillett immigrated over to the U.S. following his now ex-wife, and he pursued citizenship because he wanted this job, which is a very unique thing to do. And I think it's worth noting that there are at least 2 deputies who have gone through this 287G process who have also gone through the immigration process, and that is a very unique perspective to have, to be someone who has gone through the process and is very much invested in this because you want to enforce people going through the same channel that you had to go through to get citizenship. In addition to that, it's important to acknowledge that this was a ride-along, and so as much as we try not to interfere with the operation and as much as deputies try to show us the most authentic day of work that they do, they are aware that we're members of the media, we're aware that they're members of law enforcement, and we can only speak to what we observed with the 2 deputies that we rode along with. And so I think that is important to acknowledge when we're talking about something like a ride-along.
Mm-hmm. And so the last thing I wanted to ask about, Milo, you were taking photographs along with this. I'm sure the lighting wasn't great all the time, early in the morning like that. But, other than that, can you tell me what the process of shooting photographs for this kind of ride-along was like and what kind of things you were looking for?
Yeah, so it's funny, actually. Chief Deputy Valdir asked me the same question about halfway through the ride-along because he was curious as to what I was looking for. And I try to go into these kind of things without having an agenda. I prefer to just observe and be more of, especially in the beginning, be more of a fly on the wall, and whatever happens and just trying to document what happens. So with these kind of interactions and things, every traffic stop is different and things can go smoothly or unsmoothly, and you don't really know until it happens. Most of what I did was just document what I saw, and that was my goal going into it, and that's what I did throughout it. In between stops and driving around, I would ask questions, and the deputies and members of Highway Patrol would explain to me along the way what they were doing, so I had a pretty good sense of what was going on, and when I didn't, I would ask questions about what was happening. And I tried to honestly and unbiasedly photograph everything that happened. And the stuff at night was hard. It's a county road. There's no street lights or anything like that. And so that was definitely a challenging environment. And so it was working more with the, lights on the police car, the flashlights, that kind of thing, than anything else. And just trying to work around that in the dark was challenging. And it was very fun for me to, embrace that challenge, as well as during sunrise, that kind of in between. It's not quite light, but it's not quite dark, and trying to, still get what we needed in focus and, to have enough light that you can see what's happening, but still have that kind of, it was very dramatic. They're bright light police lights in otherwise pitch black, dark field. So trying to capture that. And then as it got lighter, just continuing to document what happened throughout the process. I also wanted to show the process of the inspection point with the highway patrol. And so what they were looking for, what those scales, looked like, what the brakes looked like. And I think also, I don't know if we touched on this earlier, but a lot of what happened at the inspection point too was a handful of vehicles were put, they call it out of service. And so those drivers were not allowed to drive away. So there were things that needed to happen, in some scenarios, a different vehicle had to come and they had to offload from one vehicle into the other vehicle with somebody who had a valid CDL license and was not, driving a vehicle that was a safety risk. The other thing that posed was, as the day progressed, truckers talked to each other and people knew that we were there. And so another issue that was happening is some of the drivers who knew that they were overweight would stop on side roads and just dump sand out onto the middle of the road until they, assumed that they were roughly around the weight limit, and then they would go to the checkpoint. And that is also a serious safety risk that they tried to enforce as well.
No, that's great.
Just trying to capture what happened, basically.
Sure. Well, thank you both for coming in and talking about this. If you haven't seen the article already, it's online, wyomingnews.com, or it was in our Wednesday print edition. Is that right? Now we'll move over. Here's Taylor Staples, our arts and entertainment reporter, with the roundup of upcoming events in the area this week.
On Monday, December 29th, there's a winter movie marathon from 10 a.m. to 2:45 p.m. for children and families at the library. The double feature plays both Frozen and Abominable. On Tuesday, December 30th, there are genealogy help drop-in times from 2 to 4 p.m. at the library. And on Wednesday, December 31st, there's a New Year's Eve ball drop at noon from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. at the library, and a New Year's Eve murder mystery dinner from 6:30 p.m. on the 31st to 12:30 a.m. on the 1st for $65 at the Cheyenne Elks Lodge. Also on Thursday, January 1st, there's the free annual first day hike starting at 1:30 p.m. at Kirkowdy State Park. For more events, go to wyomingnews.com/calendar.
And finally, before we close out today, here's a quick recap of some of our top stories and headlines from this past week. First off, Senator Cynthia Lummis announced last Friday that she will not seek re-election for U.S. Senate in 2026 after completing one full term in the seat. Just a few days later, on Tuesday, Representative Harriet Hageman announced her bid to succeed Lummis, leaving question marks around who will run for her seat next. After wildfires south of Cheyenne were fueled by 70 to 80 mile-an-hour winds last Wednesday, a large BNSF train was blown off the tracks the next night. Around 17 miles northwest of town, some locals reported being woken up by the sound of the train derailing at around 4 a.m. last Friday. 3 arrests were made last Friday following evidence that the 3 people were planning to murder an individual. The trio was arrested during a coordinated warrant operation. As a result, 18-year-old Michael de Herrera was arrested along with 16 and 17-year-old boys who were not named. And finally, unseasonably warm temperatures and unusually frequent high winds have swept through Cheyenne the past few weeks, breaking a 137-year-old high temperature record and putting the city on track to potentially see its warmest Christmas Eve and Christmas Day on record. That's all for this week's episode of Wyoming Watch. Hope you've all been having a wonderful holiday season, and be sure to check back in the new year next Friday for a roundup of the Wyoming Tribune Eagle's top 10 stories of 2025.